All right. As Aisha said, I'm Garth Ornelas. I worked with John McCartney and Min Zhang at UC Boulder, and we study the water drainage from a sill layer in a centrifuge permeameter. A permeameter is just a device that measures permeability, so remember that for later. It's important. So main goals of our project, we wanted to study the hydraulic properties of compacted silt in a centrifuge permeameter. This data we can compare with other data obtained using other techniques. One of those techniques is called axis translational technique. And basically what that is, you have a layer of soil and you apply air pressure from the top and water pressure from the bottom. And when you adjust the two, you can affect the drainage rate of the soil. And the third goal is to study the transition from liquid to vapor flow, which occurs at higher suction, because not much is known about this point of transition, and not much data is available. So the hydraulic properties of interest to us are the soil water retention curve, which is just water storage versus suction. And on the right there is a theoretical curve for sand and silt of what it should look like. And another property that we're interested in is the hydraulic conductivity function, which is essentially just versus suction. So the ease at which a fluid can flow through the soil versus time and suction. So this is another theoretical curve we have here. It's actually only been measured up to the dotted line, but based on this trend, we can assume that it just keeps going down, or that's what is assumed. It might not be correct, so we're going to get data on that to see if it is. So a couple relevant applications of the hydraulic properties of soil. A lot of weather models take into account the soil-atmosphere interaction. So the hydraulic properties affect the evaporation, et cetera, of those. And the drainage affects the flow in landfill covers and pavement and just all geotechnical establishments. And in geothermal heating and cooling, the soil around the units affects the insulation of the interactions taking place. So we chose Bonnie silt, taken from the Bonnie Dam in Yuma County, Colorado. And we chose this silt because it has a fine grain size and a low hydraulic conductivity function. So when you have it in a centrifuge, it is easier to see the properties. I'll go into other techniques. So the reason for using a centrifuge, when you're spinning, the self-weight of the soil and the water is increased. And we have a filter plate that holds up the soil, so water is allowed to drain while holding the soil up. And a centrifuge also increases the hydraulic gradient of the soil, which means that water is just going to flow faster than it would in a natural setting. And by a concept known as geometric similitude, our scale model, which was only about this big, directly correlated to a sample size of about 8 meters. So it's a lot easier to study. So this is a picture of our apparatus. On the left is just the centrifuge we used, and on the right is just the apparatus. The filter plate I was talking about is right there. So that holds up the soil while allowing water to drain in the centrifuge. So these are the different types of sensors we used. The first one is a dielectric sensor, and it measured the dielectric permittivity of the soil, which is linearly correlated to the volumetric water content of the soil. The second type is called the tensiometer, which measures pore water pressure. And it does this by only allowing water to pass into the sensor. There's a ceramic tip at the end that only allows water in, so that's how that's done. And the last one is a pressure sensor located at the bottom of the outflow reservoir, and that just measured water pressure during drainage. So I just included this to show the depth at which each sensor is placed. These are the water content sensors, the dielectric ones. And these are the tensiometers. It shows spacing, et cetera. We didn't actually have an inflow reservoir because we were testing drainage. just for reference. So this is a graph of outflow versus time, and it makes sense that it would even out because there's no water to flow after a certain point. So we just spun the specimen until it did even out. So these graphs are showing pore water pressure versus time. And so this right here is one of the tensiometers actually caveated, which means it got water inside. So that one is not really, the data after this point is not relevant. But the pressure is decreased as a function of time. And when the pressure becomes negative, you start to get suction in the soil. This graph is kind of hard to understand, but these are the tensiometers from as a function of depth. So this is the one at the very bottom of the apparatus, and it goes higher and higher. And as time goes on, pressure decreases. And from that relationship, so when it starts becoming negative, we start getting these suction curves. So pressure decreases, suction increases. That's really all this is saying. You can see that that's where that one broke, so this data is no longer valid. This is just degree of saturation versus time. So you would expect, as you spin, that the water would drain out of the centrifuge. So this makes sense. Same types of graphs. Right. And I went through all those to set up the background for how we obtained the soil water retention curve shown here. So the same factors are on the degree of saturation versus suction shown here. And this is our data overlapped with data from an axis translational test that I was talking about earlier. And the trend is pretty similar, as you can see. And the point of transition from liquid flow to vapor flow normally occurs in this zone here. So if you remember from earlier, the hydraulic conductivity function, the theoretical graph assumed that this would keep decreasing, meaning, which doesn't really make sense because you're going to run out of water eventually. But as you can see, it actually evens out. So we can't assume that. This shows that we can't assume that. So a couple conclusions we can draw are, since our data was consistent with data taken from axis translational tests, centrifuge use is a viable option for further drainage tests in silt and other types of soil. We saw that this transition point was found in a high degree of saturation, which is not normally assumed. It's normally assumed that laws of physics still apply up to a wider range of values, but we found that this point was not where they expected it to be. So, right. So that was the last assumption. Okay. Sorry, question.
Take some questions. That was really interesting. I got a little lost partway through, but I have a question about the sampling. Could you talk a little bit? You collected your data from one sample, and like how long does that whole process take? Could you talk a little bit about the actual centrifuge?
Right. So the sample, we actually ran this test 4 times. I chose the data from the best test. We spun for about 2 days on this one. So, and it still wasn't fully drained. So as I was talking about, the silt takes a very long time to drain because of the grain size and the compaction level that you choose.
Thanks, Garth. I really enjoyed that. I was wondering about the comparison with the Van Genuchten data. Your soil only got down to about 0.8 saturation,
Yes.
whereas his data showed it going down to a much drier level. Did you say he used the access translational tests? And how is that method different? And did he just run it for longer that allowed it to drain more fully, or what was the difference there?
I don't think it was the same type of soil, actually. I think it was a silt, but I think it varies based on compaction and other variables that weren't exactly the same. Do you want me to go back to the slide? Did that explain things?
Sure.
Okay. Sorry, did I pass it? I don't remember where it is, actually. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I guess if it's a different soil, then it's going to be able to drain more fully than your silt, perhaps. Thank you.
For the study you compare it to, that's that 1980 study, right? I was wondering, he wasn't using a centrifuge, right? No. What method was he using, like in physical terms, compared to what you were doing?
Okay, so conventionally, as I understand it, the first test done on drainage involved these huge specimens that are just like 10 meters tall, and they have the sensors placed on each level. That's not what he did, but the one I was talking about where you apply air pressure from the top and water pressure from the bottom, and the difference between the two is how you increase the air pressure. That's what he did. Well, his wasn't the big one. I think you can do that on a smaller scale, which is why they did that. And this is just like the progression. Like they had the big samples, they had the pressure, and then now we're trying the centrifuge approach, I guess.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Had there been other centrifuge experiments for different types of soil?
Yes, it was done with sand right before. I don't think I referenced that experiment, but the same apparatus exactly was used at CEU.
All right, let's thank Garth again.